In the case of the child beauty queen found murdered in her Colorado home, Boulder police detectives have now returned from interviewing about 30 people in Georgia, where JonBenét Ramsey has relatives and where she was buried. A spokeswoman says the police have also been in contact with the girl's mother and father and hope to interview them later this week. Diana Olick has our report.
What if the most important clue in one of America's most famous murder cases wasn't hidden in the shadows of a basement, but sitting in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, quietly daring investigators to understand it correctly? And what if the reason this case still refuses to rest is because it exposed something deeply unsettling, that even in a quiet, affluent American neighborhood, on a night meant for safety and celebration, the systems designed to protect a child could falter in ways no one wants to admit? On the morning of December 26, 1996, the JonBenét Ramsey case didn't begin as a homicide investigation at all. It began as a panic wrapped in confusion, fear, and assumptions that would shape everything that followed. Because according to official Boulder police records and contemporaneous reporting, the Ramseys woke after Christmas night to discover their 6-year-old daughter missing, and a handwritten ransom note left inside their own home demanding exactly $118,000, an amount that immediately raised quiet internal questions among investigators because it mirrored John Ramsey's recent bonus, a detail later confirmed in police interviews and court filings summarized by outlets like the City of Boulder Police Department's official case overview and long-form reporting from the Denver Gazette. Yet in those first moments, none of that mattered as much as the overwhelming belief that a kidnapping was in progress, a belief that guided early decisions inside the house before it was ever fully secured as a crime scene, something Boulder police have since acknowledged in retrospective statements available through the city's official updates. And this is where the insecurity at the heart of the case quietly takes root, because when law enforcement later reconstructed the timeline, they realized that critical hours passed while friends, clergy, and others moved freely through the home, unknowingly altering or contaminating potential evidence. A fact discussed cautiously but clearly in later police summaries, and confirmed by investigative journalists at outlets such as Crime Online and the Denver Gazette. And yet even with that knowledge, the early timeline remains chillingly simple. JonBenét had spent Christmas Day with her family, returned home late in the evening, and by early morning she was gone, with a ransom note instructing the parents not to contact police, an instruction they ignored, calling 911 shortly after discovery. A call whose transcript has been widely analyzed but whose basic facts are undisputed. And while the note promised contact from the supposed kidnapper, no such call ever came, a silence that gnawed at investigators even as they waited inside the Ramsey home, because the clock was ticking against a deadline written by someone who may never have intended to collect a ransom at all. A disturbing possibility later raised in police interviews and reinforced by the fact that JonBenét's body was ultimately found inside the house, in a basement room, hours after the initial report, a discovery made by her father during a search prompted by police, according to official accounts summarized by the Boulder Police Department and corroborated by People magazine's long-running coverage of the case. But before the devastating discovery, Module 1 of this story, the Christmas Night Mystery, forces a harder question that still unsettles both investigators and the public. How does a case with a ransom note, no forced entry conclusively identified at the time, and a child last known to be safe in her own bed, immediately fracture into multiple competing realities? And why did every choice made in those early hours echo for decades afterward? Police reports confirm that the note itself was unusually long, written on paper from inside the home using a pen also found there, a detail cited repeatedly in official summaries and analyzed by experts quoted in outlets like the Colorado Politics report on Boulder Police Updates. And while no conclusions were drawn publicly, the existence of that note alone created an investigative paradox. Was this a kidnapping gone wrong, a staged scenario, or something else entirely? And even today, Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern has emphasized that investigators must revisit those first hours without assuming answers, a position he reiterated in annual case updates reported by Crime Online and local Colorado media in late 2025, underscoring that the timeline of December 25th to December 26th is not just historical background, but an active component of the investigation, because every modern forensic test, every DNA retest, and every renewed interview traces back to decisions made before sunrise on December 26, 1996, and this is where the fear quietly tightens its grip. Because if a child can vanish and die under such circumstances without immediate resolution, it challenges the belief that time always reveals truth. Yet police maintain that time can also preserve it, as evidenced by their ongoing effort to digitize more than 40,000 reports and preserve physical evidence for future testing, a process officially confirmed by the Boulder Police Department in 2023 when they announced collaboration with the Colorado Cold Case Review Team. And so the introduction to this case is not about what we know, but about what we may have misunderstood from the very first night. Because Christmas night 1996 was not just the beginning of a tragedy, it was the moment a narrative took hold that investigators are still carefully, quietly trying to untangle, knowing that somewhere between the ransom note on the staircase and the silence that followed lies a truth that has resisted certainty for nearly 30 years, and as police themselves continue to stress in official statements, the case is not frozen in the past, it is alive, evolving, and waiting for the right question to finally be asked at the right moment. The discovery of JonBenét Ramsey's body in the basement of her family's Boulder, Colorado home on December 26, 1996 marks not only the tragic pivot from the assumption of kidnapping to the confirmation of homicide, but also the moment when the entire investigation began to unravel into one of the most complex and controversial unsolved cases in American criminal history. Because at roughly 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on that day, after JonBenét's mother Patsy Ramsey had reported her missing in Boulder, police had canvassed the house in what was initially treated as a potential abduction. JonBenét's father, John Ramsey, was directed by Detective Linda Art to conduct a thorough search of the residence. When he opened a latched basement door that officers had not checked earlier, he found his 6-year-old daughter lying unresponsive in a small room below, covered by a white blanket, her mouth covered in duct tape, her hands bound, and a length of cord around her neck, a discovery that instantly turned the case from a disappearance into a confirmed homicide investigation and forced investigators to reckon with a horrifying reality that defied the early kidnapping narrative upon which the first hours of the case had been built. For months and years after, official documents, autopsy reports, and law enforcement summaries have consistently described what was found that afternoon, not simply the body of a missing child, but the grim physical evidence indicating that JonBenét had suffered fatal injuries consistent with asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma, the technical terms used by the Boulder County Coroner's Office when they ruled her death a homicide, and these findings were not minor details, but fundamental shifts in understanding the crime, because asphyxia by strangulation tells investigators that life did not end in flight or panic, but in intentional force that stopped her breathing, and craniocerebral trauma indicates significant head injury prior to or at the moment of death, details confirmed in official police summaries and widely reported historical records of the case. What makes this transition from assumed kidnapping to homicide particularly jarring and unsettling, and a source of enduring insecurity in public and professional scrutiny of the investigation, is that, at the time JonBenét was found, there had been no sign of her being taken from the home, no reliable witness of a stranger's entry, and no confirmed entry point visible to responding officers. Details which are reflected in the earliest scene reports and have been referenced in retrospective analyses by historians and criminal justice writers covering the case. Instead, all physical evidence of her final moments was contained within the walls of the house where she was last seen alive, a fact that immediately raised critical questions. If this was truly an abduction, why was her body hidden within the same structure where she had been reported missing hours earlier? And if it was not an abduction, what motivations and circumstances could explain the elaborate ransom note and its instructions against contacting law enforcement? Instructions that were ultimately ignored by the Ramseys themselves when Patsy called 911 early that morning, setting police into motion on the premise of a kidnapping that would later prove tragically incorrect in its assumption. Investigators later determined that JonBenét's body showed signs of a ligature around her neck, formed by a length of nylon cord tied in a complex knot and partially attached to a broken paintbrush handle, a homemade garrote, and although duct tape covered her mouth when found, her cause of death was ultimately identified not by those visual cues alone, but by the detailed autopsy performed by the Boulder County coroner, which documented both strangulation and significant head trauma as lethal factors in her death. All of these forensic conclusions were part of official records and have been cited repeatedly in historical and investigative reviews of the case. The astonishing reality that a child could be killed and her body left in a cellar within her own home, a house that had been the center of dozens of interviews, forensic examinations, and public speculation, immediately raised questions about how law enforcement had handled the scene, because once her body was moved from the cellar by her father, critical chain of custody and evidence preservation concerns came to the forefront, as police had not yet thoroughly documented or processed the area where she was found, a problem later acknowledged by commentators, family members, and even some law enforcement analysts reviewing the handling of crime scenes in major cases, and this procedural misstep has been widely cited as a factor contributing to the case's long unresolved status. Compounding the insecurity was the simple, stark observation that no one witnessed any abduction. No credible evidence of forced entry was documented in the initial hours, and her body, when finally located, was already lifeless. A set of facts that defied the logic of the ransom note, which had been left as a supposed message from an outside perpetrator, demanding a specific sum of money and instructing the family not to contact police, an instruction overtly violated by Patsy, and yet still echoed in the bizarre note itself, which investigators later found had been written on paper belonging to the Ramsey household and contained oddly specific language that some analysts linked to popular media content of the time, further unsettling the narrative of an external kidnapper with no apparent trace of presence beyond that seemed to be manufactured from within the home. The discovery of JonBenét's body also triggered intense internal speculation within law enforcement agencies about whether they were dealing with an intruder or someone known to the family, because many investigators initially grappled with the reality that the crime scene was immediately contaminated once her father removed her body, potentially destroying fingerprints, trace evidence, and biological material that could have identified an external perpetrator, a procedural fragility that remains a focal point of criticism and analysis among forensic experts studying the case decades later. Yet regardless of the early scene complications, the coroner's ruling of homicide established a legal and investigative threshold that the case would never step back from, because homicide signifies that evidence supports intentional killing by another person, a conclusion that underpins all subsequent investigative efforts and forensic inquiries, including advanced DNA testing and cold case reviews that continue more than 25 years after that initial discovery, reflecting on this grim reality. Boulder police have reiterated in their official annual updates that the case remains active and that understanding the basement discovery, its context, timing, and the physical evidence present is still central to unraveling the truth of what actually transpired that Christmas night and the early hours of the following day, when the innocence of a child was replaced by questions that continue to challenge investigators and the public alike. What remains haunting about the basement discovery is not merely the physical evidence of death itself, but the unresolved tension it created between the earliest assumptions. If JonBenét was abducted, why was she never removed from the property? And if she was never abducted, why was a ransom note left that misled everyone involved, including law enforcement, for precious hours? A question that continues to fuel both investigative work and public fascination, and highlights how a single discovery, a body beneath a blanket in a basement, can redefine not only a crime, but the very framework of hope, doubt, and the pursuit of justice in a case that has refused to yield definitive answers even after decades of scrutiny. The investigation into JonBenét Ramsey's murder quickly became something that even seasoned law enforcement professionals struggled to categorize, because almost immediately after her body was discovered in the basement, the case exploded outward in scale rather than narrowing inward toward a suspect, creating a volume of information so vast that it paradoxically made resolution harder instead of easier. And by the early 2000s, Boulder police and cooperating agencies had logged more than 21,000 tips, conducted over 1,000 formal interviews, and pursued leads that stretched not only across Colorado, but throughout at least 17 U.S. states and several foreign countries. A scope later confirmed in official summaries released by the city of Boulder and echoed in long-form reporting by outlets such as the Denver Gazette and People magazine. Yet despite this extraordinary breadth, not a single suspect was ever formally charged, a reality that continues to define the case and quietly frustrate both investigators and the public alike. From the outset, detectives were flooded with calls from ordinary citizens, self-proclaimed psychics, amateur sleuths, journalists, and individuals claiming insider knowledge. A tidal wave of information that forced police to devote enormous resources simply to triage what was credible and what was noise. And internal police documents later summarized by investigative journalists describe how entire teams were assigned solely to tip management, not suspect development. A fact that underscores how quickly the case became a logistical challenge as much as a criminal one, because while most homicide investigations move from chaos toward focus, this one seemed to expand endlessly, creating what some analysts later described as investigative paralysis, where too many possibilities existed at once and eliminating them consumed years without producing a prosecutable narrative. The pressure was amplified by relentless national and international media attention, which descended on Boulder almost immediately, transforming a local homicide into a global spectacle. And as cable news, tabloids, and talk shows competed for exclusive angles, investigators found themselves working under a microscope, their decisions scrutinized in real time and often misrepresented, a dynamic acknowledged years later by Boulder officials who noted that the constant public commentary complicated witness cooperation and evidence handling, because people began tailoring statements to media narratives rather than memory. A phenomenon well documented in high-profile cases and discussed in retrospectives by History.com and Biography.com when examining why the Ramsey case resisted closure. Within this environment, suspicion cycled relentlessly, shifting focus from hypothetical intruders to family members to outsiders, and back again, not because police publicly accused anyone, but because the absence of charges created a vacuum that public opinion rushed to fill, and law enforcement was forced to walk a narrow, ethical line, repeatedly emphasizing that no one had been proven guilty while simultaneously continuing to investigate all viable leads. a stance reiterated in official police statements over the years, and most recently reinforced by Police Chief Stephen Redfern, who has stressed that the department's role is to follow evidence, not narratives. A quote reported in multiple verified outlets including Crime Online and Colorado Politics. Internally, the sheer number of interviews tells its own story of scale without resolution, because speaking to more than 1,000 individuals across multiple jurisdictions suggests not a lack of effort, but an investigation struggling to consolidate information into a single coherent theory that could withstand prosecutorial standards, and prosecutors themselves have acknowledged this difficulty, with Boulder District Attorney offices over the years citing evidentiary challenges, conflicting interpretations of forensic material, and concerns about reasonable doubt as barriers to filing charges, points that have surfaced repeatedly in reputable reporting and court-adjacent commentary without ever naming a definitive suspect. What makes this volume particularly haunting is that it did not diminish with time, as cold cases often do, but instead accumulated, with new tips arriving years after the crime, often triggered by documentaries, books, or anniversaries, forcing investigators to revisit old ground repeatedly. A cycle that added layers rather than clarity, and while many of these leads were eventually ruled out, each required documentation, cross-checking, and in some cases travel and coordination with other agencies, further expanding the investigative footprint without narrowing its focus. Media pressure played a dual role in this expansion, because while it kept the case in public consciousness and generated tips that might otherwise never have surfaced, it also fueled speculative theories that hardened into public belief, making it harder for police to quietly test hypotheses without backlash. And former investigators have noted in interviews cited by major publications that the case became a lesson in how publicity can distort investigative priorities, not through corruption or intent, but through sheer volume and expectation, where every decision feels consequential not just legally, but culturally. Over time, this dynamic created repeating cycles of suspicion that never resolved into accountability, as new persons of interest would dominate headlines briefly before being cleared or quietly fading from focus, leaving behind the same unresolved core facts: a child murdered, evidence collected, DNA tested, and yet no indictment, no trial, no verdict, a pattern that eroded public confidence while simultaneously deepening fascination, because the human mind struggles with unfinished stories, especially when the effort invested appears so disproportionate to the outcome. Official figures released by Boulder Police and summarized in later updates confirm that despite the massive scale of investigative activity, including consultations with the FBI and external experts, the case reached the early 2000s with its fundamental question unanswered, a reality that did not signal abandonment but stagnation. As leads became harder to generate and existing evidence resisted definitive interpretation, particularly as forensic science evolved and earlier testing methods were reevaluated, a point now emphasized in modern cold case reviews. What continues to unsettle observers is that volume itself became the defining characteristic of the investigation, not because police failed to act, but because they acted so extensively without achieving prosecutorial closure. A contradiction that challenges assumptions about justice systems, namely the belief that effort naturally leads to resolution, and this is where the insecurity deepens, because if more than 21,000 tips, over 1,000 interviews, interstate and international cooperation, and decades of scrutiny cannot produce charges, it raises an uncomfortable question about how many other cases hinge not on truth alone, but on timing, technology, and the fragile alignment of evidence strong enough to survive court. A concern that modern investigators openly acknowledge when discussing why the Ramsey case remains open. As of the most recent official updates, Boulder police have reiterated that no individual has been charged in JonBenét Ramsey's murder, not because the case lacks attention or effort, but because the threshold for justice has not yet been met, a single haunting constant that persists despite the unprecedented scale of the investigation, and it is this unresolved imbalance, massive effort without legal resolution, that continues to define the case, reminding the public that in some investigations, answers do not fail for lack of work, but because certainty itself remains just out of reach. The promise of DNA in the JonBenét Ramsey case has always carried a peculiar weight, because from the late 1990s onward it represented both the greatest hope for resolution and the most persistent source of frustration, a scientific lifeline that repeatedly suggested progress while stopping just short of providing an answer, and to understand why. It's important to recognize that biological evidence was indeed collected from JonBenét's body and clothing during the original investigation, including samples from her underwear and long johns, which were later tested using the forensic DNA methods available at the time and, crucially, entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, a national database designed to match unknown DNA profiles against known offenders and other crime scene evidence. A step confirmed in official Boulder police summaries and reiterated in multiple public statements over the years, when those early tests failed to produce a match to anyone in the database. Investigators faced an unsettling reality, because DNA, often portrayed as a definitive truth machine, had not pointed toward a perpetrator, but it did accomplish something else that would quietly reshape the case. It excluded people, including members of the Ramsey family and numerous other individuals who had fallen under suspicion, a fact formally acknowledged in 2008 when the Boulder District Attorney publicly stated that the available DNA evidence did not match the Ramseys. Language that has since been echoed carefully in subsequent police communications to avoid overstating what the evidence can and cannot prove. Yet exclusion is not identification, and this distinction lies at the heart of the intellectual tension surrounding the DNA evidence, because while the presence of an unidentified DNA profile suggested the involvement of someone outside the immediate family, the samples themselves were limited, mixed, and degraded. Characteristics that complicate interpretation and reduce the statistical power of any single result, a challenge explained repeatedly by forensic experts consulted by law enforcement and quoted in reputable outlets such as the Denver Gazette and Crime Online, which have emphasized that the DNA recovered was not a clean, single-source profile but rather a mixture that could include contributions from more than one individual, potentially even through secondary transfer, meaning innocent contact at some point before or after the crime could theoretically deposit trace material. Over time, as forensic science advanced, these limitations became more apparent rather than less, because newer techniques revealed just how fragile the evidence was. With samples so small that testing them risked consuming them entirely, a concern Boulder police have explicitly referenced in annual case updates, noting that investigators must balance the desire to apply cutting-edge methods against the irreversible nature of DNA testing when only minimal material remains. Despite these constraints, the DNA was entered and re-entered into CODIS multiple times as technology improved, each submission renewing a quiet hope that a match might finally appear, yet each time the result was the same. No hit, no named suspect, no arrest, only confirmation that the profile did not belong to anyone currently in the system, a reality that both narrowed and widened the case simultaneously by ruling people out while leaving the identity of the contributor unknown. This paradox fueled public misunderstanding, because many assumed that DNA exclusion equated to definitive proof of innocence or guilt, when in reality, forensic experts and prosecutors have consistently cautioned that DNA evidence must be interpreted within context, especially when samples are mixed, degraded, or incomplete. A point underscored in educational statements by the FBI and echoed in reporting by People magazine, which has covered the case with an emphasis on what DNA can realistically establish. The issue of mixture is particularly significant here, because mixed DNA profiles complicate statistical analysis and make it difficult to assign probability in a courtroom setting, and in the Ramsey case, analysts have noted that the unidentified DNA found on JonBenét's clothing was present in very small quantities alongside her own DNA, raising unresolved questions about when and how it was deposited, questions that modern forensic science can sometimes address through advanced sequencing and genetic genealogy, but only if the sample quality and quantity are sufficient. This is why, even as DNA technology revolutionized cold cases across the country, solving crimes once thought unsolvable, the Ramsey case remained stubbornly resistant, not because investigators ignored science, but because the science itself ran into physical limits imposed by time, handling, and the original circumstances of evidence collection, limits acknowledged by Boulder police. When they announced renewed efforts in 2023 to review and digitize evidence in collaboration with the Colorado Cold Case Review Team, emphasizing that DNA remains a focus but not a guarantee, public discourse around the DNA evidence has often swung between optimism and skepticism, with some seeing it as definitive proof of an unknown intruder and others warning that over-reliance on such a small, complex sample risks oversimplifying a multifaceted case, and law enforcement has consistently positioned itself between these extremes, reiterating that the DNA evidence is important, relevant, and actively reviewed, but not dispositive on its own, a careful stance reflected in statements by Police Chief Stephen Redfern reported by Colorado Politics and Crime Online, where he stressed that investigators must consider all evidence holistically rather than allowing any single element to dominate the narrative. What heightens the tension is that DNA did what it was supposed to do in one sense. It cleared people, yet failed in the way the public most wanted, by naming someone, and this outcome challenges the popular belief that forensic science inevitably leads to closure, revealing instead that science can sometimes only narrow the field, not close the case, especially when evidence is compromised or incomplete. Over the decades, advances such as touch DNA analysis, low copy number testing, and forensic genetic genealogy have reignited hope, particularly as high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer demonstrated what was possible. But even advocates of these methods caution that they are not magic solutions, and Boulder police have confirmed that while they are exploring new technologies, they must do so carefully to preserve evidentiary integrity, a sentiment echoed by independent forensic analysts quoted in reputable media who note that consuming the remaining DNA without achieving a usable result could permanently foreclose future options. This ongoing balancing act explains why the DNA narrative in the Ramsey case feels perpetually unresolved, because each technological leap raises expectations that the case is on the brink of being solved, only to confront the same foundational problem. The evidence can exclude, suggest, and hint, but it cannot yet identify, and as of the most recent official updates, no DNA match has resulted in charges or arrests, a fact that Boulder police continue to state plainly while reaffirming their commitment to testing when and where science allows. In this sense, DNA has become both the most powerful and the most frustrating element of the investigation, a symbol of modern forensic potential constrained by the realities of a crime scene that was never fully protected in its earliest hours. And this is where the rehook tightens, because the very evidence that cleared individuals and reshaped public understanding has also stalled the path to accountability, leaving behind a haunting constant that defines the case to this day. DNA told investigators who did not commit this crime, but it has never been able to say who did. The moment John Mark Karr entered the JonBenét Ramsey story in 2006, the case experienced a surge of emotional whiplash so intense that it briefly felt as if a decade of uncertainty was about to collapse into resolution, because after years of stalled leads, inconclusive DNA testing, and public fatigue, the announcement that a man had confessed to the murder of JonBenét Ramsey ricocheted across global headlines with astonishing speed, triggering wall-to-wall coverage from the United States to Europe and Asia, and for a public long condition to believe that this case might never be solved. The confession felt like a release valve finally opening. Karr, a former elementary school teacher living in Thailand at the time, contacted authorities and journalists claiming intimate knowledge of JonBenét's death, making statements that investigators initially considered troubling enough to warrant immediate action, and within days, he was arrested, extradited to the United States, and flown to Colorado under intense media scrutiny, a process documented in contemporaneous reporting by major outlets and later summarized in investigative timelines by History.com and Biography.com. During this brief window, the case appeared to pivot dramatically, because Karr spoke in emotional, obsessive terms about JonBenét, describing details that seemed, at first glance, to suggest insider knowledge and law enforcement, under pressure, to act responsibly, treated the confession seriously while simultaneously moving to verify it through the one tool that had increasingly become the gatekeeper of truth in modern investigations: DNA. The emotional stakes could not have been higher, because for the first time since 1996, there was a named individual in custody who publicly claimed responsibility, and for the Ramsey family, for investigators, and for a public exhausted by speculation, the possibility of closure seemed suddenly real, yet almost as quickly as hope surged, it collapsed. Because when Karr's DNA was tested and compared against the unknown DNA profile recovered from JonBenét's clothing, the same profile that had already excluded the Ramsey family and numerous other suspects, the result was unequivocal: no match. A fact confirmed by the Boulder District Attorney's Office, which announced that Karr could not be linked to the crime through forensic evidence and that he would not be charged. A decision reported widely and later cited as a defining moment in the case's history. The narrative that had seemed so compelling in headlines disintegrated under scientific scrutiny, exposing a painful truth about the investigation and about human psychology itself. Namely, that desperation for resolution can make even implausible answers feel convincing when uncertainty has lingered too long. Investigators later acknowledged that while Karr's statements were disturbing, they were also inconsistent and often contradicted known facts of the case, and forensic analysis made it impossible to move forward legally, reinforcing a principle that prosecutors have repeatedly emphasized in this case: confession alone, without corroborating evidence, is not justice, a stance discussed in reputable legal commentary and reinforced by law enforcement statements at the time. The collapse of the Karr confession had ripple effects far beyond his brief detention, because it not only reset the case back to zero in practical terms, but also deepened public cynicism and mistrust, as many questioned how such a dramatic episode could unfold without leading to accountability, while others pointed to it as evidence of responsible policing, a willingness to test claims rigorously rather than bending facts to satisfy public demand. Emotionally, however, the damage was done, because the episode demonstrated how vulnerable high-profile cold cases are to false hope, especially when media amplification accelerates conclusions before evidence can catch up, a phenomenon that criminologists and media analysts have since cited when discussing why sensational confessions often dominate headlines despite their frequent unreliability. In the Ramsey case, the Karr episode became a cautionary chapter, reminding investigators and the public alike that notoriety, obsession, or even apparent knowledge do not equate to guilt, and that DNA, for all its limitations, remains a critical safeguard against wrongful prosecution, even when it disappoints those yearning for answers. The emotional whiplash was particularly acute for the Ramsey family, who had endured years of suspicion, scrutiny, and grief, only to see another narrative rise and fall without resolution. A cycle that reinforced the sense that the case was trapped in a loop where every apparent breakthrough dissolved under examination. Law enforcement officials later reflected, in statements summarized by People magazine and Colorado-based news outlets, that the Karr confession underscored the importance of maintaining investigative discipline in the face of public pressure, because acting too quickly on unverified claims risks not only injustice, but also the erosion of credibility when those claims inevitably fail. What makes the episode especially haunting in retrospect is that it did not introduce new evidence, new DNA, or new forensic insight, but instead highlighted how thin the line can be between progress and illusion in long-running investigations, where the mere appearance of certainty can overshadow the hard, methodical work required to actually prove a case. After Karr was cleared and released, the case returned to its familiar state of unresolved complexity, but with an added layer of caution, as investigators became even more wary of high-profile leads that could not be substantiated, a shift that some analysts argue slowed public-facing developments but strengthened the integrity of the investigation itself. Yet for the public, the unanswered question lingered with renewed intensity, because if someone could confess so publicly and be ruled out so definitively, it raised an unsettling implication. The true perpetrator had never come forward, had never been identified through DNA, and had never been charged, despite decades of scrutiny, and one of the most exhaustive investigations in American history. This realization reinforced the emotional core of the case, not by offering closure, but by stripping away illusion, reminding everyone involved that truth does not always announce itself dramatically, and that confessions, headlines, and spectacle can mislead as easily as they can illuminate. In the aftermath of the Karr episode, Boulder, police reiterated that the case remained open and that all credible leads would continue to be evaluated, a position they have maintained consistently in the years since, including in recent annual updates that emphasize caution, evidence preservation, and the responsible use of advancing forensic technology. And so the rehook tightens once more, because the failure of the most public confession in the case, history leaves behind a sharper, more uncomfortable question than before. If not John Mark Karr, then who and why, after all the attention, all the tips, all the tests, and all the confessions, has no one else ever been held accountable? As the years passed after the collapse of the John Mark Karr confession, the JonBenét Ramsey case entered a quieter, heavier phase, one defined less by breaking headlines and more by absence, loss, and the slow erosion of public certainty, because time did what it always does in unresolved tragedies. It carried people forward while leaving answers behind, and nowhere was this more visible than in 2006, when Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother, died of ovarian cancer at the age of 49, a development that did not advance the investigation in any evidentiary sense, but fundamentally altered its human landscape, closing the chapter on one of the most scrutinized figures in modern true crime without ever delivering resolution. Patsy's death was reported widely by major outlets, not as a development in the case itself, but as a somber milestone, because for many observers it underscored a painful reality, that a parent who had lived for a decade under suspicion, media pressure, and unimaginable grief would never see the case resolved in her lifetime, a fact that deepened the emotional complexity of public memory surrounding the crime without assigning blame or absolution. By this point, the investigation had already drifted, at least in public perception, into what many casually referred to as a cold case. a label that implies stagnation, neglect, or abandonment, even though law enforcement agencies are careful with that term, and Boulder police in particular have repeatedly clarified in official statements that cold does not mean inactive, only that a case lacks immediate leads. A distinction that matters profoundly in understanding what was happening behind the scenes during these quieter years. Outwardly, media coverage slowed, anniversaries came and went with diminishing intensity, and new generations grew up knowing the name JonBenét Ramsey as a cultural reference rather than a living investigation, while internally, evidence was not discarded or forgotten, but catalogued, preserved, and revisited periodically as forensic science evolved, a process later confirmed by Boulder police when they disclosed that thousands of reports and physical items had been maintained specifically to allow future testing when technology improved. This contrast between public silence and institutional continuity is where the insecurity subtly shifts, because the absence of visible progress can easily be mistaken for inaction. Yet investigators have emphasized that some cases require patience measured not in months or years, but in decades, particularly when evidence is limited, degraded, or contextually complex, as it was here. During this period, the Ramsey family itself receded from the public eye, with John Ramsey largely stepping back from regular media appearances, a move interpreted by some as withdrawal and by others as a necessity for survival, while law enforcement continued to reiterate, often quietly and without fanfare, that no one had been charged and that the case remained open, statements that rarely generated headlines but formed a consistent thread in official communications. The notion of public memory becomes especially important in this phase because as time distances events from the present, narratives tend to harden, simplifying what was once nuanced into fixed beliefs, and in the Ramsey case, this meant that theories, intruder versus insider, accident versus homicide, conspiracy versus incompetence, solidified in the public imagination even as investigators resisted committing to any single explanation without sufficient proof, a divergence that widened the gap between what the public thought it knew and what law enforcement could responsibly say. Meanwhile, the physical evidence itself became a kind of silent witness to time, preserved in storage, logged and relogged, its value paradoxically increasing as technology advanced while its condition remained static, a reality acknowledged by forensic experts, who have noted that older cases often benefit from new methods precisely because earlier limitations prevented certain analyses, an argument that would later resurface when genetic genealogy began solving other long-dormant homicides. During these years, the Ramsey case functioned less as an active investigation in the public sense and more as a benchmark, frequently cited in discussions about investigative mistakes, media influence, and the psychological toll of unresolved crimes. Yet within Boulder police, it remained a file that could not be closed, both legally and ethically, because homicide without resolution does not expire, and this principle guided the department's quiet commitment to preservation rather than pronouncement. The death of Patsy Ramsey intensified this sense of irreversible passage, because it made clear that time does not pause for justice, and that even if answers eventually emerge, they may arrive too late for those most directly affected, a sobering reality that humanizes the case without romanticizing it, reminding observers that behind every theory and headline are lives permanently altered by loss and uncertainty. As the late 2000s turned into the 2010s, the case's public profile dimmed further, resurfacing mainly during anniversaries or in response to documentaries and books, which often reignited debate but rarely introduced new, verifiable information, reinforcing the impression of dormancy even as investigators continued to guard the evidence, waiting for the moment when science or circumstance might shift the balance. Boulder police have since stated that this period was not one of abandonment but of stewardship, ensuring that what remained could still be used responsibly, a philosophy that became explicit in later years when the department began digitizing tens of thousands of pages of reports, a task that reflects long-term investment rather than neglect. The emotional weight of this era lies in its stillness, because unresolved cases do not end with dramatic conclusions, they persist as unanswered questions, living on in archives, memories, and the quiet determination of those tasked with safeguarding the possibility of truth, and the Ramsey case exemplifies this reality more than most, existing in a liminal space between history and active inquiry. This is why the phrase, cold case, can be misleading, because while public attention cooled and familiar faces disappeared from view, the fundamental obligation to seek justice never dissolved. An idea Boulder police would later emphasize explicitly when announcing renewed efforts and collaborations, making clear that the passage of time had not diminished the case's importance, and so the rehook emerges not from spectacle but from persistence, because the absence of headlines does not equal absence of purpose, and the years following Patsy Ramsey's death reveal something quietly unsettling yet cautiously hopeful, that even in silence, evidence can be preserved, cases can be remembered, and the search for truth can continue without applause, reinforcing the idea that cold does not mean abandoned, only waiting. By the time the calendar turned toward the mid-2020s, the JonBenét Ramsey case had reached a point that few long-running investigations ever do, where age itself became both an obstacle and an opportunity, because nearly 3 decades after the crime, Boulder police made a deliberate decision to change how they were working the case without changing what they were willing to say publicly, creating a strange but significant moment often described as the case reopening without reopening, a phrase that captures the tension between visible silence and internal momentum. In 2023, the Boulder Police Department formally acknowledged that it had engaged the Colorado Cold Case Review Team, a specialized, multidisciplinary group designed to re-examine unsolved homicides with fresh eyes, modern methodology, and independence from earlier assumptions. A move confirmed in official city statements and reported by multiple reputable outlets, and while the announcement itself was understated, its implications were not, because cold case review teams exist precisely to challenge investigative inertia, asking uncomfortable questions about evidence handling, timelines, and blind spots that may have been normalized over years of familiarity. Central to this renewed effort was the digitization of the case itself, an enormous undertaking that involved scanning, cataloging, and cross-referencing more than 40,000 pages of reports, tips, interviews, photographs, and laboratory records. Accumulated since 1996, a figure Boulder police have cited publicly to illustrate both the scale of the investigation and the necessity of modern tools to manage it, because what once existed in filing cabinets and disparate formats could now be searched, analyzed, and connected in ways that were simply impossible in the 1990s or early 2000s. This process was not about uncovering brand new evidence hidden in a forgotten box, but about allowing old evidence to speak differently when placed into a digital ecosystem, where patterns, inconsistencies, and overlooked connections could emerge through comparative analysis, a strategy increasingly common in contemporary cold case work and one that reflects lessons learned from other high-profile cases solved decades later. Alongside digitization came renewed interviews, a fact Boulder police have confirmed cautiously, emphasizing that witnesses, associates, and individuals previously interviewed may be recontacted not because they were suspected of wrongdoing, but because memory, context, and perspective evolve over time, and statements that once seemed inconsequential can take on new meaning when viewed through a modern investigative lens, especially when paired with updated forensic understanding. This phase also included the reevaluation and, where feasible, retesting of physical evidence using current forensic techniques, particularly in the realm of DNA, although police have been careful to stress that such testing is governed by strict limitations, including the quantity and condition of remaining samples, and the irreversible nature of consuming evidence during analysis, a concern reiterated in annual updates and echoed by forensic experts quoted in credible reporting. What distinguishes this period from earlier bursts of attention is not a dramatic arrest or sensational revelation, but restraint, because under Police Chief Stephen Redfern, who became permanent chief in 2024, the department has adopted a communication strategy that prioritizes investigative integrity over public reassurance, repeatedly stating that while work is ongoing, details will not be released prematurely, a stance Redfern has articulated clearly in interviews and official remarks reported by Colorado Politics, Crime Online, and local Colorado media. This approach has created a peculiar form of hope rooted not in promises, but in process, because for the first time in years, law enforcement is openly acknowledging movement without narrating it, confirming actions rather than outcomes, and in doing so, subtly signaling that the case is being treated as active, not archival. The involvement of the cold case review team is particularly significant in this context, because such teams often include professionals from outside the original investigative chain, reducing the risk of confirmation bias and institutional defensiveness, and Boulder police have indicated that this collaboration is intended to ensure that no avenue is dismissed simply because it was explored unsuccessfully in the past, a philosophy that aligns with modern best practices in cold case investigations. Yet despite this renewed activity, the department has been explicit about what it will not do: speculate, name suspects, or characterize evidence beyond what has already been established, a boundary that frustrates some observers but reassures others, especially given the history of misinformation and sensationalism surrounding the case. Annual updates released in late 2025 and reiterated into 2026 reinforce this position, stating that investigators are committed to following leads, leveraging advancing forensic science, and working collaboratively with state and federal partners, but declining to disclose specifics in order to protect the integrity of an active investigation, language that may seem repetitive but is carefully chosen because it reflects an awareness of how easily public interpretation can outrun facts. The retesting of evidence, in particular, has become a focal point of public interest, largely because of high-profile successes in other cold cases solved through forensic genetic genealogy, and while Boulder police have acknowledged awareness of these developments, they have stopped short of confirming whether such methods have been applied in the Ramsey case, noting only that advances in science are continually evaluated, a cautious stance that balances optimism with realism. John Ramsey himself has spoken publicly during this period, expressing hope that modern DNA techniques could finally bring answers, while also acknowledging the challenges posed by degraded and mixed samples. Statements reported by People magazine that humanize the moment without presuming outcomes. The tension here lies in the contrast between visible effort and invisible results, because unlike earlier eras marked by leaks, theories, and public disputes, the 2023 to 2026 phase is defined by quiet labor, where progress is measured internally rather than announced, creating an atmosphere that feels simultaneously promising and opaque. Critics argue that transparency could build trust, while supporters counter that restraint is precisely what was missing in the early years of the case, and Boulder police appear to have chosen the latter interpretation, opting for methodical review over performative updates. This strategy reflects a broader shift in how cold cases are managed in the modern era, recognizing that public pressure, while understandable, can distort investigative priorities, and that some answers require patience rather than publicity. What remains undeniable is that the case has re-entered active institutional consciousness, not as a relic of the 1990s, but as a living investigation shaped by contemporary tools and sensibilities, a transition underscored by the formal language used in recent updates, which consistently refer to ongoing work, new interviews, and reevaluation of evidence, rather than closure or conclusion. The rehook, then, is not a revelation but a posture, because police are telling the public exactly what they are willing to say, and no more, confirming effort without confirming discovery. And in doing so, they leave behind a charged silence that invites attention without feeding speculation, a silence that suggests movement without map. After decades of noise, this quiet phase feels different, not because it promises answers, but because it demonstrates commitment in the absence of certainty, reinforcing a cautious form of hope rooted in action rather than announcement. And it is here, in this deliberate restraint, that the case once again unsettles expectations, because the most unsettling message from 2023 to 2026 is not what investigators claim to have found, but what they insist on doing, quietly, persistently, and without spectacle, reminding the public that the search for truth is still underway, even if the details remain out of reach. The genetic genealogy question hangs over the JonBenét Ramsey case like a door that may only open once, because unlike traditional forensic testing, this approach offers the possibility of identifying a person who has never been in any police database, while simultaneously carrying the irreversible risk of consuming evidence that can never be replaced. And that tension is exactly why, nearly 30 years after the crime, investigators are both hopeful and cautious. Forensic genetic genealogy, explained simply, is not about matching DNA to a known criminal, but about using tiny fragments of genetic material to build family trees by comparing them to voluntarily submitted profiles in public genealogy databases, then working backward through relatives, generations, and records until a potential individual emerges, a method that has transformed cold case investigations across the United States, most famously in the 2018 identification of the Golden State Killer, where decades-old crime scene DNA led investigators to a suspect through distant familial matches rather than direct hits. A breakthrough that reshaped law enforcement expectations overnight. Since then, cases long considered unsolvable have quietly found answers through similar techniques, including homicides and sexual assault cases from the 1970s and 1980s, fueling public belief that genealogy might be the final key to the Ramsey mystery, especially given that DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing was entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system and did not match any member of the Ramsey family or dozens of other investigated individuals. Yet the very facts that make the case intriguing also make it uniquely difficult, because the DNA involved is not a clean, single-source sample but a mixture, meaning genetic material from more than one person is present, and according to forensic experts cited in credible reporting, mixed samples complicate genealogy because algorithms designed to trace lineage require relatively clear profiles to establish reliable familial connections. Adding to this challenge is degradation, as biological material collected in 1996 has aged, and while modern techniques can extract information from smaller quantities than ever before, there is still a point at which testing becomes destructive, consuming the sample entirely in pursuit of data that may or may not be sufficient to build a usable genetic profile. This is why Boulder Police, under Chief Stephen Redfern, have repeatedly emphasized restraint when discussing DNA, acknowledging advances in science, while refusing to confirm whether forensic genealogy has been attempted, a silence that reflects not reluctance, but responsibility, because once a sample is used, it cannot be put back, and a failed attempt could permanently close doors rather than open them. Comparisons to other cold cases often overlook this distinction, because in many genealogy successes, investigators had access to larger, cleaner samples or multiple pieces of evidence, whereas in the Ramsey case, available DNA is limited, partially mixed, and already subjected to years of testing, meaning each new analysis carries higher stakes. Forensic analysts have explained in interviews and articles that genealogy is not a magic wand, but a probabilistic tool that works best when conditions align, and in this case, those conditions are uncertain at best, a reality that tempers public optimism even as it fuels suspense. John Ramsey has publicly advocated for the use of advanced DNA techniques, expressing hope that genealogy could finally identify the person responsible for his daughter's death. Yet even he has acknowledged, in remarks reported by People and other outlets, that the science is complex and the outcome far from guaranteed, a rare moment of alignment between family desire and investigative caution. What makes this question so unsettling is not simply the possibility of failure, but the finality of the choice, because investigators must weigh the promise of resolution against the ethical obligation to preserve evidence for future technologies that may be even more precise. A dilemma echoed by cold case experts, who note that science does not stand still, and methods considered cutting-edge today may look crude a decade from now. Boulder police had indicated in official updates that they continuously evaluate emerging forensic tools, suggesting that genealogy remains on the table without confirming its deployment, a deliberate ambiguity that keeps hope alive while acknowledging limits. The public, meanwhile, oscillates between impatience and understanding, with online discussions frequently debating whether waiting is wise or wasteful, a debate that underscores how deeply the case remains embedded in collective consciousness. The comparison to the Golden State Killer looms large, but so does the cautionary reality that not every case yields to the same solution, and that genealogy success stories represent a subset of conditions rather than a universal guarantee. In the Ramsey investigation, the stakes feel higher because the evidence is finite, the expectations immense, and the margin for error razor-thin, meaning that one wrong move could erase the very traces investigators hope will speak. This is why the question of genetic genealogy functions less as a solution and more as a suspense point, a reminder that progress in this case is not measured by announcements, but by decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that balance hope against preservation. The rehook, then, is painfully simple and profoundly unsettling, because the test that could finally name a suspect is the same test that could exhaust the last viable biological evidence, leaving nothing for the future to reinterpret. And until investigators decide whether the promise outweighs the risk, the case remains suspended in a fragile equilibrium, where science offers a light forward, but only at the cost of burning the bridge behind it. The tension between family advocacy and investigative silence has become one of the most emotionally charged and ethically complex dimensions of the JonBenét Ramsey case, because as years stretch into decades, the need to speak and the need to stay quiet begin to pull in opposite directions, raising an unsettling question that lingers beneath every update and every interview. What if the answers already exist, but cannot yet be spoken aloud? On one side stands John Ramsey, a father who has lived nearly half his life in the shadow of an unresolved homicide, whose public statements in recent years have been marked not by accusation or anger, but by cautious optimism, particularly as advances in forensic science reopen possibilities that once seemed unreachable. And when he speaks to the media, as he has in interviews with outlets like People.com and during coverage of renewed police efforts, his words are carefully chosen yet emotionally resonant, emphasizing hope, patience, and faith in modern DNA technology, while also advocating for the use of forensic genetic genealogy, a tool he believes could finally identify the person responsible for his daughter's death. John Ramsey's advocacy is not loud or inflammatory, but persistent, rooted in the belief that science has moved far enough to justify renewed urgency, and in multiple interviews, he has expressed gratitude that Boulder police have recommitted resources to the case, framing his optimism not as certainty, but as possibility, a subtle but important distinction that reflects both a father's longing for closure and an awareness of investigative constraints. Yet opposite this hope-driven narrative is the deliberate restraint of law enforcement, a silence that can feel cold to the public but is often necessary to protect the integrity of an active investigation, especially one as fragile and scrutinized as this, where premature disclosure could contaminate witness testimony, compromise forensic strategies, or trigger misinformation cycles that have historically plagued the case. Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern has addressed this tension directly in official statements and interviews, acknowledging public interest while reiterating that details cannot be shared without risking harm to the investigation, a position echoed by the Boulder District Attorney's Office, which has stressed that homicide cases, even decades old, require discretion precisely because a single misstep can undermine years of work. This contrast between what the family feels compelled to say and what police feel obligated not to say creates an emotional fault line, because silence, while professionally justified, can easily be interpreted as stagnation or concealment, especially by a public conditioned to expect transparency and regular updates, an expectation amplified by the media landscape in which constant information flow is the norm rather than the exception. The insecurity hook embedded here is deeply human, because silence invites speculation, and speculation fills the vacuum left by unanswered questions, leading some to wonder whether investigators know more than they are admitting, whether evidence has pointed somewhere uncomfortable, or whether bureaucratic caution is masking uncertainty, even though official statements consistently frame the silence as strategic rather than evasive. John Ramsey himself has navigated this space carefully, avoiding criticism of police while still urging progress, a balancing act that underscores the ethical complexity of advocacy in an open case. Because families must grieve publicly while investigators work privately, each bound by different responsibilities and risks. Media coverage often amplifies this tension by juxtaposing hopeful family quotes with restrained police soundbites, creating a narrative of imbalance even when both sides are aligned in their ultimate goal, which is resolution grounded in evidence rather than conjecture. The public, meanwhile, occupies an uneasy middle ground, torn between empathy for a father seeking answers and respect for investigative process. A dynamic visible in online discussions where some praise John Ramsey's persistence while others defend police caution, reflecting a broader societal debate about transparency versus effectiveness in criminal investigations. This dynamic is further complicated by the history of the case itself, which was marked early on by leaks, intense media pressure, and public suspicion cycles that many experts believe hindered progress, a legacy that likely informs current law enforcement restraint. Because investigators are acutely aware that anything they say can be misinterpreted, weaponized, or distorted, potentially reviving the very chaos they are now trying to avoid, Boulder police have emphasized in updates from 2023 through 2025 that their focus is on action rather than announcement, citing new interviews, evidence review, and forensic evaluation without disclosing specifics. A strategy that prioritizes substance over spectacle, but requires patience from a public accustomed to narrative closure. John Ramsey's optimism, when viewed through this lens, functions less as pressure and more as a reminder of stakes, humanizing the case in a way that official silence cannot, because while police speak in terms of procedures and protocols, families speak in terms of loss and time, unlike evidence, cannot be preserved. The ethical tension intensifies when considering that some investigative information, if released prematurely, could jeopardize future prosecution. Meaning that even if investigators have promising leads, they may be legally or strategically bound to withhold them until corroboration is complete. A reality that fuels the haunting possibility that progress exists beyond public view. Forensic experts have noted that successful cold case resolutions often appear sudden to the public precisely because groundwork was laid quietly for years, reinforcing the idea that silence does not equal inactivity, but that understanding requires trust, something this case has struggled to maintain due to its long history and cultural prominence. John Ramsey's statements often reflect this awareness, as he has publicly acknowledged that police cannot share everything, even as he expresses hope that continued advancements will eventually justify disclosure, positioning himself not as an adversary to law enforcement, but as a partner in patience, albeit a strained one. This interplay between advocacy and silence creates a narrative tension that sustains interest without providing answers, because it forces observers to confront uncomfortable questions about justice delayed, information withheld, and the emotional cost of waiting, especially when the victim was a child whose story remains unfinished. The rehook emerges from this unresolved balance, because the idea that answers might exist, locked away behind procedural necessity, is both reassuring and deeply unsettling, suggesting that truth may be closer than it appears while remaining frustratingly out of reach, and until investigators decide the moment is right to speak, the space between what the family hopes and what police reveal will continue to define this phase of the case, leaving the public suspended in uncertainty, listening closely to what is said, and even more closely to what is not. The most unsettling thing about the JonBenét Ramsey case is not what we know, but what we are forced to sit with now, because nearly 3 decades later this is not a story sealed in history books or frozen in the past. It is an active homicide investigation moving forward in near silence, one where progress is measured not by press conferences but by quiet reviews, retested evidence, and decisions made far from public view, and that reality reframes everything. Because when a case is truly over, it announces itself loudly, with arrests, trials, and verdicts, but when a case is still alive it often grows quieter, not louder, retreating from speculation and spectacle as investigators narrow their focus. Boulder police have been explicit in recent years that the Ramsey case remains open, that new interviews have been conducted, that evidence has been digitized, preserved, and reassessed, and that modern forensic science continues to be evaluated, yet they have also been equally clear that they will not say what they are finding, only what they are doing, a restraint that feels frustrating until you consider that many cold case breakthroughs only become visible at the very end, after years of unseen groundwork, when a name suddenly replaces a question. This is why the pressure now feels different, heavier and more intimate, because hope no longer comes from theories or televised debates, but from the possibility that somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports or within a microscopic trace of DNA, something has shifted just enough to matter. The truth, if it arrives, may not explode into the public consciousness with sirens and breaking news graphics. It may surface quietly through a lab result, a genealogical connection, or a reinterpreted detail that finally locks into place, and by the time the public hears about it, the most important work may already be done. That possibility is what makes the waiting so uncomfortable, because silence invites the uneasy thought that answers could already exist in fragments, not yet strong enough to name, but too significant to ignore, and once that door opens it cannot be closed again. This case has taught us that certainty can collapse overnight, that hope can mislead, and that time does not guarantee clarity, yet it has also shown that persistence, preservation, and patience can keep truth alive long after attention fades. So the pressure remains, not just on investigators, but on the idea of justice itself, because every year that passes raises the stakes of what resolution would mean, and who will still be here to witness it. And the final question does not ask who did it or when answers will come, but something quieter and far more unsettling, because if the truth does emerge after all this time, will it arrive loudly enough to satisfy the world, or softly enough that we almost miss the moment when a mystery finally stops being one?